very popular. Now next we have Arthur Rowe. Arthur is the Managing Director of Arthur Rowe and Associates Chartered Accountants, both in Melbourne and in Sydney. And Arthur has been a passionate collector of art for, gosh, how long, Arthur? Over 20 years?
Yes, over 20 years.
He has got an incredible collection of abstract art, most enviable. And we have invited him here today to shed some light on how we can pursue our love for art with the most financial wisdom that we can. Thank you, Arthur.
Thanks very much, Claire. I found both those talks incredibly interesting, amazing. I also got to give a rap to Claire's gallery because I've known Claire for over 15 years, and you know, I come across a lot of galleries, but I think she's really got the model working beautifully. She's incredibly hard working, and I would challenge anybody that's looking for any form of art if they can't find something at Claire's gallery, because it really has a wonderful spread from emerging to, you know, to established artists, and I think she's a very understated gallerist. Let me tell you, she's very capable. Now, you know, I'm talking about tax and all this sort of stuff, but I just want to sort of initially say that I have been collecting for a long time, and to me, collecting is a very serious business. I'm passionate about it beyond belief, totally and utterly addicted, and you know, great collectors must be addicted. It's just, there's no question about that, and all the things that Charles was saying earlier, I relate to. But also, it's been an incredible part of my life. I mean, you know, I'm a chartered accountant, I do all these things, but then, you know, for the last 25 years I've had the chance to have the left side of the brain being actively involved, and there are a number of things that I've discovered is that artists are probably the hardest working people I've ever come across in my life. You know, you get this bohemian sort of view of the world, but, you know, they just work 7 days a week, thinking, doing, and in many cases, you know, they don't earn a lot of money early. And I remember many years ago talking to a quite senior artist, and he says that his objective in life was to basically be able to work full time as an artist, pay his mortgage and send his kids to school. And he said, if I can achieve that, then that's the greatest achievement I can get. And I thought that was fascinating, you know, in terms of, and it's been fun. It's been enormous fun, because obviously when you get involved in art, you start to meet so many different people, and it enriches your life enormously. So in talking about what I'm talking about today, I'm coming at it from, you know, as a collector, and so when I want to talk about financial matters, I want to make them interesting, because sometimes they can be boring, but I actually don't think this will be boring, because my theory is everyone here, I'm assuming, is interested in acquiring art or has some interest in it. So if I can maybe put through some ideas which might make acquiring that art a little bit less expensive, then I would have thought that's pretty sexy in itself. So, and that's coming from a chartered accountant, right? So I want to sort of talk about a few things. I want to talk about this whole area of self-managed super funds. I want to talk about small business tax concessions, because I think there's some pretty remarkable things there. And then fine art as an investment, and I want to look at that a little bit differently to what I think most people do. So I'm going to get Maymo, you're going to press these little buttons. So that's sort of a bit of an overview, and you've got some notes there. So this whole thing about self-managed super funds, I think is really interesting, and a lot of things that I read in the press are so wrong. I saw an incident recently at Deutsche and Hackett had an Indigenous art auction, and it's all on public record. There was a component of that sale was a self-managed super fund selling its artwork. Now, all of this artwork had been acquired inside the last 5 years. So post the new rules coming in. So it wasn't something they acquired pre the new rules. A lot of this artwork still had wrappers on it. Now, they actually bought some really, really good contemporary artwork. It was outstanding, in fact. But as we all know, if you buy it in the last 5 years, particularly in the climate we've been in, and then look to sell it in 5 years, knowing that you're going to pay about 25% commission on that sale, somehow you don't have to be Einstein to realise you're going to take a bit of a hit here. And they did. They had some things that sold very well, but basically I would have thought they lost 50% of what they paid. Now, the reason apparently was because of the self-managed super fund rules, but if that was the reason, then maybe they should have come and spoken to me, because I would have said to them, even if you had to pay some insurance, which you should have done anyway, you had to store the work, but if you ultimately really wanted to sell the works, maybe you should have done it over a more protracted time and been a bit smarter about it, because it was just insane. Maybe that wasn't the reason why they were selling, I don't know. So what I want to do is just very quickly look at these rules, both pre and post, and then talk about the fact I still think you can use super funds if you want to, and give you some reasons as to how that applies. So what we've got up here is just a simple little chart, and really what it comes down to is the rules pre-1 July 2011, between July 2011 and June 16, and post-June 16. So I want to talk about this thing called the sole purpose test, because a lot of people say, well, why on God's earth should the government tell me what I should do with my work in the super fund? Well, unfortunately, it always comes down to the law. And there's a simple thing in the superannuation tax law. It talks about a thing called the sole purpose test. And in essence, what it says is if a super fund invests, its sole purpose should be for the fund's retirement. Now, sole means 100%. They did allow incidental use, but that's fair enough if that's the rules and they're giving you a concession. So what used to happen pre was you could have incidental use. The asset could be leased to a related party, and I in fact had works in my super fund that I leased to our practice. The works could be stored at home, and I guess there's a bit of a nudge, wink, wink in that. You've got it stored, probably on the wall, but anyway, and that's what was happening clearly. You didn't need written documentation as to its storage. The asset could be insured under a personal home and contents policy, and the trustee, if it was ever sold, you can't sell a work to a super fund, but you can buy from it. I'll come back to that point in a minute. But you could just have a valuation yourself to buy it from. So it was pretty open, but really at the end of the day, there were still some rules there. Now, Jeremy Cameron came in and changed all of this and sort of said, well, no, in reviewing super funds, you can't have art. I believe what he should have done is he should have said, you can have up to 20% of the super fund. Because around the world, there are international funds that invest in collectibles. And this guy comes in, he's a bureaucrat, he's into super, he knows nothing about art. I think he probably knows nothing about a lot of things, really. But, most people that were using their super funds to buy art weren't using 100% of their super fund. They were using small components. They still had shares, managed funds and all of that sort of thing in there. All they had to do was consult the industry, talk to some people who actually knew what was going on, and Catherine very exquisitely talked about the industry and how from one sale of art, all of those small businesses can have an interest and grow, and all we had to do was put a cap on what you could do with collectibles. And you know what? Most people would have been under that cap and the art industry would not have been hit like it was. Again, governments of both persuasions have no idea and do not consult the people they need to consult. And Jeremy Cameron was okay in the broader picture, but that microcosm he didn't deal with. So now we go to what happened after 1st of July, and what happened was these new rules came in. So everything you had prior to 30 June 11, you had a 5-year period where those things you didn't have to comply with. The things you acquired after 1st of July 11 up to 30 June, you had to comply with these new rules. And what they were, you can't have a related party is permitted to use the work. No leasing to related parties is permitted. The asset cannot be stored at home. It can be stored in a business, out in the filing room or whatever. Or more importantly, it's probably got to be filed at IAS or some proper storage place. You've got to have written documentation as to how it's stored, etc. The asset has to be insured again. Technically it should be in any event. And if you do a transfer of ownership from the super fund to yourself, you have to have a third party valuation. We'll come back to that issue later. Then we come to 30 June 16, all it means is all of those rules I've just talked about apply to what you acquired from 1 July 11 and everything that you had prior to 1 July 11. Now, a lot of people, I believe, thought, oh well, and they hadn't maybe taken advice on this, whatever. I think a lot of people, from what I'm seeing with all this, hysteria in the media, probably got to the sense that you just got to get rid of everything at 30 June 11, or it was going to be so difficult. Well, it's not difficult. I mean, if you're going to get the works out, do it progressively, store them if you have to, comply. It might cost you a little bit, but I tell you what, it costs you a lot more if you drop 50% of your value by, selling the entire collection through an auction house and paying 25%. It's insane. So, can we use them going forward? Now, I think you can. And I think there are times when opportunities will present themselves. Many years ago, a barrister that I acted for, and this was after the global financial crisis, a Brett Whiteley work came up. And it was actually a very good picture, and I think the price that this picture came up with was fundamentally low, because everyone's running scared and whatever. Now, not everyone has a spare $500,000 or 750,000 sitting around, but they might have it in their super fund, because this guy had a lot in his super fund. Came to talk to me, we went through the discussion. We knew that that picture would be in 10 years' time. We knew when everything settled down, this was an opportunity. He would not be able to afford it, possibly in 10 years' time. But here was an opportunity. I call this the incubator concept. That's my idea. So he took the money and he bought the picture. And guess what? That picture's worth twice as much now. No question. Because we're buying an iconic artist that was on the dip. And you know what? Probably didn't even bother him because he just wanted the picture. He subsequently retired, and what's happened is he's in pension phase. The work's worth $1.5 million. He's actually got some money outside now for various other things, downscaling, whatever. Cuts a cheque for $1.5 million, pays his super fund, thank you very much. Gets his Brett Whiteley up on the wall, no superannuation constraints, and the super fund's got $1.5 million that he can now invest into shares and manage funds and whatever. Is that a smart strategy? Of course it is. Now, it doesn't have to be $750,000, $1.5 million pictures. Think about it. Young people. Now, I will say up front, I'm not about putting 100% into art. But, go back to my concept, the 20%. Collectibles. And with your super fund, the good thing about these changes is you've got to think about it. Don't buy nonsense. Buy things that are. So you've got a young executive, kids at private school, mortgage. They've got a little bit in his self-managed super fund, which he's built up. Now an opportunity comes along to buy a really good artwork for $20,000, but at the moment I can't quite buy it. But it's something you want. By doing a little bit of homework, that it's probably something that will do quite well. Now, if you've been around the scenes for a while, there are artists you just know are going to do all right. And you can talk to Catherine, Claire, and I'll come back to the concept later on about investment, because I don't get too hung up on that. But there's an opportunity where you've got the money, you can buy the artwork. Yes, you can't put it on your wall. If you play totally by the rules, that's all right, store it. And at a future date you can buy it back, and then it's yours. And that buying back might only be 3 years, because it might be just at the moment you can't afford it. Get it valued, put the money into the super fund, because you've got the money then and you can do it. So it's only incubating. And so it's not, if you're really into art and there's an opportunity to get something, and there's that opportunity it could be an auction, it could be anywhere. You can use your fund sensibly within limits. Just comply with those rules. So I do not agree that super funds are out of the equation. I think with the right advice and the right work, it can still make some sense. Small business tax concessions. Now, this is an interesting one. At the moment, they're technically up to $2 million. The government in the budget has suggested they should go to 10. And I think that's perfect. The Labor Party's not in support of that. But 10 million is not a huge business. I think that 10 million limit will get through, because I think with the crossbenchers, Xenophon, Pauline Hanson, Darren Hinch, a few of these, I think will actually support it with trade-off. So I reckon my tip is that will happen, which will open up the market for more. But here's the interesting thing. What the concessions are is that, in particular, you get accelerated depreciation. Now, at the moment, you can depreciate art at 1.9%. Not bad if it's an appreciating asset, but it's not big. Accelerated depreciation gives you 30%. 15% in the first year, 30% thereafter. If you buy it in the business, you get a GST refund. So I did a little example to try and put some numbers around this. So if we look at, I think it's missed that's the self-managed super fund one. These numbers, we've got a massive amount of numbers here, but I think when you feel like you need to look at this. But what basically happens is we've used the concept of a 10-year acquisition program on this artwork, and say it's $110,000. It might be a series of artworks, but you buy it for $110,000. Business buys it. First thing it does, you've done a commercial or a chattel mortgage, which you can do, and there are funders who will do this. First 5 years is you buy the work for 110. It's got a balloon, just like a motor vehicle. A balloon at the end of the 5 years of 55, and you pay it off principal interest for 5 years, and it comes down to 55,000 at the end of year 10. You've got to check the cut to 55. Take it back, that's fine. Or you can then fund it for another 5 years, 55 down to 0. So it's 10 years. And you might have a batch of works that you put in your office for this 110. Could all be very good works. The bottom line is what happens in the first year, you get the 10% GST back. That's great. You can then claim all the interest, and these calculations just show on a depreciated basis how that works. But most importantly, first year you can claim 15% depreciation, second year 30, 30, 30, 30. Now the bottom line of all of that, and that's what I should tell you what that is. The artwork, I've conservatively grown the value of that artwork at 5%. When I talk about the third section, we talk about artwork depreciation. What happens is the artwork is worth, or group of artworks are worth $162,889 after 10 years. The cost of, after-tax cost of funding that artwork over the 10 years is $106,666. So what's basically happened is you didn't have the money initially, you funded it, you borrowed, and with all of those tax concessions, if the work, that group of works grows by simply 5% a year, you're actually $56,223 up on all of your after-tax costs, even though you never had the money initially to borrow. Now, have a look at those numbers, but that's pretty interesting. Very interesting, because if you wanted the artworks to start with, and you've got a business, it actually makes it incredibly efficient in acquiring that way. So, they're just a couple of ideas that if you've got a business, or if you want to use your super fund, there's still a way of doing all of this and doing it very effectively. Let me turn to fine art and investment. Now, the first thing I'll say about this is if you start buying artworks because you want to become very wealthy and art is an investment, you will fail. No question. Because that's like going to the racetrack. However, you listen to what Charles said earlier. I've got a focus as well in what I do, and I've changed it over the years, but I believe that the concept of the 80-20 rule is alive and well. What will happen is, if you have a focus, and if you live and breathe art, read about it, talk to people with knowledge, galleries, other collectors, artists, you actually get a bit of a feeling. And I know that many years ago I could have bought a number of Del Catherine Bartons, but she wasn't my style. I appreciated her as an artist, but I knew she was going to fly price-wise, but I didn't do it because it wasn't my focus, as Charles was talking earlier. But I've got other things in my focus that have done well, but to me it's always been about putting together a really, really good collection. And that can be done by anybody, whether you're extremely wealthy or you don't have a lot. It's about your focus, as Charles says. You focus around your budget, you focus around what your interest is. And so what will happen, to a T, is 20% of those artworks will actually do incredibly well. And it'll surprise you over the long term. The other 80%, some will do okay, some will go backwards, some over 45 years will be worth what you paid for them. But the reality is, you'll still end up with a portfolio that grows in value. Not because you set out to do that, but it will happen. Trust me, it'll happen. And that can't be a bad thing. You know, if you're into racehorses, you're into fast cars, there's a lot of people have hobbies. Sailing, my God, wonderful hobby. But the great thing about art is that it's a wonderful hobby, but it actually can pay a dividend, because single owner collections, if you look at Moss Green and whatever, they're the ones that always sell well, because people buy passion, they buy knowledge, and the collection that there've been several collections over the years, but the Laverty collection to me, which when they sold off their Indigenous art collection and their abstract collection, they got some of the highest prices for artworks, you know, double, triple what had happened in multi-vendor sales, simply because it was them. And their stamp and who they were meant so much, and it added and embraced the value of the artwork. Ildiko Kovacs, Aida Tomescu, record prices by proverbial mile, because it was the Lavertys. So what you do is you publish, you have art museums, not because you want to become rich through your art, but it's just a byproduct, because it happens. People know about you. And, you know, I think with the Justin Hart Art House Museum, I think what you'll find is that there'll be some artists that people probably haven't been that aware of, and through what you've done, people become very aware of them. And therefore, you know, that their careers could take off to another level. It's very interesting. So I think that the other thing about investment is the byproducts, what I call the negative dividend. If you look at Art Bank, prior to the GFC, Art Bank, everything they acquired over the years had about a 7% compound growth over 20 years. I think with art, it's a little bit less than that. And it's actually not dissimilar from shares and property. The difference with art is, unless you can rent your art out if you want to, but quite often what it is not a dividend. So shares and property basically look over 100 years, they don't differ that much. The capital value and the dividend, or the capital value and the rent, are not that dissimilar over the long term. It's just that the various things, some are more liquid than others. Art's the same. The capital growth in art's about the same with a diversified portfolio as what it is for property or shares. You just don't get the dividend or the rental unless you decide to rent it out. It's really what happens with investment. But the thing is with art, the negative dividend is the joy that you get from it. It's you know, how many times do I look at the things I love? What value do I get out of that? Well, to me, it's incredible value. And you wouldn't do it if you didn't. So you make the judgment on that yourself as to what the aesthetic and the beauty and the concepts and just standing there with a glass of wine talking to someone about your artwork. I'll tell you what, that just rots my socks. You know, it does. And if it doesn't, then don't do it. So that's the negative dividend. It's sort of the money or the dividend you don't see, but it's that wonderful cultural thing. And I'm sure that there are people that pay 170 million for a Picasso just to have it on their wall for the reason you stated. There's no doubt about that. I won't be doing that. But I've got things that I feel that are as good as a Picasso, as I'm sure you guys do. So that's just some ideas, trying to make tax and investment interesting from a collector and accountant's point of view. But just think that there are things you can do to make it more affordable. And the bottom line is you've got to have fun. Thank you.